Good morning, all. Welcome to our fifth series of the SANS Cloud Security Aviata Solo Flight Challenge. This is Chapter 5, Centralizing Cross-Cloud Security Events. I'm going to drop a couple of notes out here into the Zoom chat for you, which looks like Hayes has done for us already. So lots of references there. The main one is getting to aviata.cloud, which will be your guide for the instructions, and I'll show you what that looks like here in a moment. And also getting into the cloud Discord. So in that Discord, if you scroll through the channels, you'll find a channel in there called Aviata. Let me find it. And I actually have a post in there from yesterday as well. So that's where did it go? There it is, Aviata. So it's in the kind of the text channels section. So Aviata Cloud Workshop Series 2024 is the name of that. So as we're getting things going here, make sure you jump in there and join those. I mean, we'll be kind of taking a look at the Zoom chat as we go. If you've got to drop questions in there, go for it. However, the Discord allows us to more easily post screenshots and thread things and put in kind of like rich text markup for commands and stuff like that. So it's just a little bit more full featured for you. So we'll keep an eye on the QA and the chat and things like that as we go along. But with that, that's kind of some of the admin stuff for getting going. Some of you probably are repeat workshop attendees. And if have followed along with chapter 1 through chapter 5, or I guess 4 up to this point, welcome back. We're happy to have you back for chapter 5 as we kind of pick up where we left off in the last part of the story. So in chapter 4, and this will be helpful for those of you that maybe have not followed along so far, in chapter 3, we'll go back one, introduced Aviata's new initiative to open up their infrastructure a little bit and become a little more modern with Kubernetes. And you practiced building a Kubernetes application and opening up some pods and services and ingress controllers to see how traffic can route from the outside world down into a pod that's running in the cluster. And then in chapter 4, you saw some things that could go wrong with that. And with improper permissions and improper configurations inside of that cluster, you were able to set up a reverse shell on the cluster and start exfiltrating some data from a precious Aviata bucket that had some super secret flight plans and things like that stored inside of it. So you ran some queries in chapter 4 locally inside of AWS, and those queries were CloudWatch logs insights queries. So those were allowing you to query some of the VPC flow logs and also some of the cluster logs that were inside of the account. And today in chapter 5, what we're going to do is look at moving some of those logs into the centralized SIM. And that SIM for our target for this exercise is going to be in Azure, and it's going to be using the Microsoft Sentinel SIM. And from there, what you'll be able to do is you go through the workshop instructions, you'll be able to repeat a small piece of the attack section from chapter 4. We'll try to open up a reverse shell from that cluster again. And from that connection, you'll actually see that log data show up in Microsoft Sentinel, and you'll be able to actually see that data from over on the Microsoft side. And you can start to add detections to it and alerts and follow your SIM pattern that way. So that's what we're going to be up to here. Let's go ahead and jump through a couple of slides, and I'll get you off into the setup exercise, which hopefully you've had a chance to start poking around with that already. If not, I'll give you about 30 minutes to at least get your flight simulator launched and also get the Aviata cloud infrastructure deployed. And while that's deploying, we can even take a look at creating our Sentinel resource over on the Azure side. So you can kind of do those in parallel with each other. Quick introduction, if you've not taken a class with me or seen any of the work that I've done with SANS in the past, my name is Eric Johnson. I've been with SANS now for over 10 years and have authored a number of different courses. Right now, primary focus is on the cloud security curriculum, with Sec 540 being cloud security automation focused. So think DevSecOps and think cloud native with Kubernetes, and supply chain security and things like that have been some of our big updates here in the last year or so. And Sec 510 is all about cloud security controls and mitigations, things you can mess up, wrong boxes you can check, things that you can fix just with configuration. And then Sec 549 is the latest class that we've launched into the curriculum about a year ago. It was a year ago, August, that we ran the first actual Sec 549 cloud security architecture course. And that's been growing. So we're seeing a lot of students jump in there, and it really focuses on just cloud security components and piecing things together from the enterprise perspective, ways that you can set up your organization or your Azure tenants in hierarchies and set top level policies and start to share networking components and funneling things through centralized firewalls, et cetera. As part of that class, we also talk quite a bit about centralizing audit log data, which is the primary focus here today, is to get the logs into the central SIM. So that's some of the background for me. I work for a company that I co-founded when I'm not teaching for SANS or working on classes called Puma Security, where we focus pretty heavily on cloud automation, CI/CD, code analysis, things like that. So my contact info is on the slide. Feel free to reach out if you got questions or anything afterwards. LinkedIn's on there. With that, I'll go ahead and jump over to the workshop roadmap. Number one, in order to do this, you're going to need an AWS account, and you're also going to need an Azure subscription. So you need both, because remember, the goal is to get things in AWS flowing over into Sentinel. So you're going to have to set things up on both sides. So in the very first section, which I'll give you a 30-minute block here to work on, that is to get your environment built out. And then we'll move into configuring the Sentinel workspace. And then we've got to go back over to AWS and set up permissions for Sentinel to actually sign into your AWS account, grab the log data and pull it over. And once those permissions are there, we can go into the AWS connector, give it some information about exactly what we're going to be pulling as far as what log types and where they live at. And finally, in the last section, hopefully we've got enough time for it, you can redo that EKS cluster attack, and you can see that data show up over on the Azure side. So that's our roadmap. Getting started, and a lot of these have been posted in the Zoom webinar chat already. Make sure you join the Cloud Ace Discord. Ben and I will be focusing mainly on that for questions and things as we go. Also, you can access the workshop instructions. So that's kind of the step-by-step instructions with screenshots at sec549.com/Aviata05. It's just a URL shortcut that I've put in there to get you there a little bit easier. Ben's also got the links and all those things dropping into the Zoom chat as well. So that's how you get started. What you need to work on first is to build your environment. And this is just a summary. The instructions are in that link that I just gave you. So find the getting started section inside of build your environment. And the short story is you're going to go into AWS. You're going to switch your region to US East 2, because that's where our Cloud Flight Simulator AMI is hosted at, and open up a Cloud Shell. And you'll open up that Cloud Shell and just run one command. You're going to run an installer script, and that will provision you an EC2 instance that's running a bunch of different services for you to browse to in the browser. And in order to get to those, you need to set up a certificate. You need to import a CA cert into Firefox so it trusts our code.sans.labs domain. And it also gives you a smart proxy configuration file, which is just a SOCKS 5 proxy that will tunnel anything that ends in sans.labs down into that EC2 instance. So there's a little bit of Firefox configuration you've got to do to get to the point where you can browse the code.sans.labs and then just go to File, open Workspace from File, and there's an ACE135.code workspace file you can open, which will give you a code directory and a couple of other directories in the left-hand navigation, as you're seeing in the screenshot here. From there, we just have you run a couple commands to clone a repo, launch a Terraform stack, and that will run for like roughly 20 to 30 minutes. So once you get to the point where you're in the simulator and Terraform is deploying, that's a happy moment for you. You've gone through the build environment section. And while that's running, if you get done kind of before I actually come back on and talk about the next step, you can move forward. You don't necessarily, and I'll show you kind of what the final output looks like here. Here's the kind of apply complete section there. You can see that this output basically is saying, hey, I'm done. And when you see apply complete, that means that the whole infrastructure is there. But once you get to the Terraform commands just saying, I'm creating this, and this, technically you can just move on to the next section where you create your Sentinel workspace. So either way will work for you. So with that, go ahead and jump into the instructions, register your AWS and your Azure clouds, configure that cloud security flight simulator, and get that Aviata infrastructure deploying. And once it's deploying, like I said, you can move on to the Azure side and create your resource group in your Sentinel workspace if you want to. It'll just give you more time to play around with log files a little bit later. But for now, I will put 30 minutes on the timer. We'll see you back here in about, let's see, be about 10:40, at least on the East Coast. And we'll walk through some of the stuff that we should have done, and we'll jump off into the next section. All right, we'll see you back here shortly. Reach out in Zoom chat or the Discord chat if you get stuck anywhere, let us know. All right, we'll catch you here shortly. So we've got just a couple seconds here till we get things cooking again. Hopefully those of you following along are to the point where you've at least got Terraform running as part of that build your environment phase. So what I'll do is I'll jump over to our flight simulator here. So the goal in that opening build your environment section was, one, to get into AWS. So let me jump over to AWS and look at the EC2 instances in the Ohio region. When you ran that install command in Cloud Shell, you should have received some output that said I launched the ACE 135 simulator with just a couple of random words at the end of it. Mine's please shepherd. Yours can be, whatever Terraform decided was going to be your random name. So that's what that script did. And as part of the output, it also gave you a smart proxy configuration file, which in the smart proxy plugin, you needed to import into the smart proxy extension and then just select that ACE 135 range. And that'll allow you to browse to code.sans.labs. And inside of code.sans.labs, you wanted to go to File, Open Workspace from File, and that'll put you in the home student directory, and then just double click that ACE 135 code workspace. And that will give you the view that I've got showing on the screen here. So let me zoom in on this just a little bit so you can see it a little bit better. From there, you can go to Terminal, New Terminal, and that will give you this embedded shell down here on the bottom. And you can run some commands in here. So in the code directory, what we had you do is clone a repository that's also on the EC2 instance, which is our ACE 135 repo. And you went ahead and changed your directory into the code ACE 135 source infrastructure directory. And from there, you could set a couple of environment variables and run a Terraform apply command. And that's going to go in and create your infrastructure. And it does take a little while. So as long as Terraform is running and it's creating the infrastructure, you can kind of let that run in the background and then jump over into the next step of the instructions, which is creating a Microsoft Sentinel workspace. So that's what we're going to talk about here for just a moment. And then I'll set you free on getting over into the Azure side of things and making sure that you can create a resource group in a Sentinel workspace that AWS will start communicating with by the time we hit the end of the workshop. So that's where you should be right now, and no pressure if you're not there. You don't have to tear everything down at the end of the discussion, right? You can keep kind of poking at it as the day goes on. Just make sure you don't let this stuff run indefinitely, because it will rack up a pretty decent charge in your cloud account. So we just don't want you to forget about it and have an unexpected surprise at the end of the month. So as we take a look at the overall architecture, this is what we're striving towards here today. So what Terraform is creating for you right now, and there's a bunch of resources that are not on this slide, but at the end of that build your environment Terraform deployment, you are going to end up with this audit logs bucket that is collecting flow logs from the Kubernetes nodes VPC. And you're also going to end up with CloudTrail logs flowing in there. And those are things that we can very easily pump over into Microsoft Sentinel. And the way that that works, and we'll cover this a little bit later, I'll show you exactly what happens, is when you finally get your Azure Sentinel instance created and your log analytics instance created, you're going to end up with this workspace ID that's attached to these two resources. And what we'll do is we'll come over here and set up an IAM role that's got permissions to read this audit log data from the bucket if the request is coming from our Sentinel workspace. And then we're also going to set up two queues, and those queues are basically going to tell Sentinel when new log data is ready. So there's an S3 push event or create object event that goes into the queue, and then Sentinel can see, oh, I've got a new file I need to download. It can pop that message off the queue, go read the file, and just process them as new messages hit the queue. So that's what we're moving towards as we push through the environment over the next hour and 15 minutes. That's where you'll be at the end of it. So I'd just like to give you a big high-level picture of where we're going. In order to start getting there, I need you to log into your Azure subscription, create a new resource group, which I named mine Sans Aviata Sentinel-RG for resource group. And that will have you create a log analytics workspace associated with it. And then you can go to the settings, and you see on the screen here, you need to copy your workspace ID. That's a value that you need to then in the next section turn around and give AWS, because that value is used to authenticate your Sentinel instance into the AWS account. So in this section, you're just creating a resource group, creating the workspace, and grabbing that ID. It doesn't take very long to do this part. What I'll do is give you about 10 minutes here just to make sure we've got enough time to look at the cool stuff to just get those two things created, and then copy that workspace ID onto your clipboard, and then we'll talk about it real quick. If you're done and you've got extra time, feel free to just keep moving forward. You don't need to wait for me, because you're going to turn around and set that ID in an environment variable in the simulator and then redeploy Terraform, and it'll create some of those resources that we just looked at on the diagram. So I'll put 10 minutes on the timer. Go ahead and jump in there and get that Sentinel workspace created, and then we'll circle back and take a look at it here in just a few. All right, welcome back, everybody. Hopefully you're just getting to the point where you've got your Microsoft Sentinel workspace created. So I'll show you what that end result should look like before we move over to the next section. Let me jump back over to Azure. So at this point, if you go to your resource groups, I've got a couple extra things in here for other stuff, but you should see the Sans Aviata Sentinel resource group. That's what I named mine. And I'll just go ahead and click on that. And you should have a couple of resources in there. So as you take a look at the resources, you then went into the Sentinel service and you created a Sentinel instance. And as part of that instance, you created a log analytics workspace. So you'll have two things in there. Aviata Sentinel is the log analytics workspace, and then security insights with that name in parentheses is how they name the actual Sentinel instance that sits on top of it. And you can click on that. So if I go ahead and go in here, this is kind of one way to get into that particular workspace. So here's the settings and kind of some of the general stuff for the log analytics workspace. Let me go into the Sentinel service. You can kind of see what the front end for this looks like. So you should have one of these in here now in your subscription. And if you open that up, you'll get into the UI a little bit. For right now, there's not really anything going on in here because you have to actually set up logs that flow into it. But if you go to the configuration and the settings, and then go to the workspace settings, this is the screen I showed you as we headed into that particular exercise, what I want you to do is actually copy this workspace identifier right here. Don't use my value, use your own. And this value is going to be used to authenticate into AWS. So that's where we kind of paused at the end of that section for creating the Sentinel workspace, which brings you to the next step, which is actually going into the AWS Sentinel configuration. So at this point, in order to move forward, you need to have had your initial build the environment Terraform deployment complete. So hopefully that's done by now. If not, you'll have to wait a few minutes for that to finish before you can move forward. So we jump back over to the slides. What we're going to do now is go back into your cloud security flight simulator. And in the simulator, hopefully where Terraform has said, hey, I successfully created those 87 resources or whatever the number is, it changes every so often. What I want you to do is go into the terminal, and in the terminal, you're going to export one more Terraform variable called Sentinel Workspace UUID, and you're going to paste in that value that I had you just collect onto the clipboard. So that particular value, when you set it, is going to tell Terraform to do some extra things. So that's all you really need to do is export that variable and then run Terraform apply again. And it's going to go in and create some extra resources for the Sentinel integration. So that's where we're at in the progression. That deployment will not take very long. So export the environment variable, run apply. That usually will create in just a couple of minutes. So again, I'll probably put 10 minutes on the timer here. I don't think it'll take 15 if you're kind of following along with us, and let that run. And once that's done, you'll have some AWS resources that we can spend a few minutes to walk through. I'll kind of show you what that Terraform did and give you an idea of how that's setting it up for Sentinel to log into your AWS account. So 10 minutes out, and we'll jump back in and take a look. All right. So let's jump back in here, and we'll get to the glue that gets Sentinel flowing the logs in there, which I'll give you a little bit longer of a block with this because it does take a little while for those logs to show up. So now that we've got the, let's see, sure, Discord alerts work for me. The AWS resources out there, we'll take a look at what that actually did. When you deployed that, if we take a look over in your AWS account, there's a couple things that were created. If you go to the IAM service, you'll notice that you've got a new identity provider here at stswindows.net. And the 33E0 tenant ID is Microsoft's Sentinel tenant. That's where their services are running under. So what you're saying is that through OpenID Connect Federation, the Sentinel service or the Sentinel tenant is allowed to assume roles inside of an AWS account with those signed JSON web tokens. They set this special audience. That's just the value that they know is coming in. So this has to be there in order to trust the Sentinel tenant. What we also did, if you go to your IAM roles, there's a new role in here called OIDC, Microsoft Sentinel role. And it's a very specific role. That role, if you take a look at the trust relationship here, and this is some AWS IAM wizardry. I've done a lot in the past with kind of federated identity and OIDC role assumption in AWS. So you can check out a past workshop I did called Nymeria, NYMERIA. That is another workshop where you set up OIDC trust in AWS, except this time it's from an Azure VM, not the Sentinel tenant. But what this is doing is it's saying all of the tokens from that identity provider that I showed you just a second ago can assume this role, but then we add a couple of conditions in here. One, we check the audience, and two, the role session, which is the name that you give the session when you assume the role inside of AWS, has to have a very specific value, which is Microsoft Sentinel _ And what you should see here, if you remember that Sentinel workspace ID, the one that you copied onto the clipboard in the last section and then pasted as a Terraform variable, this is where that's used at. So what this is saying is that only your Sentinel instance is allowed to assume this role. And this prevents confused deputy problems where, in my Sentinel tenant, I could put in your role ARN and try to start pulling data out of your account. And that won't work because we're in different Sentinel workspace IDs. So that's where that value ends up at. That allows your workspace to, in your workspace only, to assume this role. And from there, we've got a policy on here that says it can go read data from the Aviata logs bucket. And then we've also got a couple of queues that were put in here. If you go to the SQS queues, we've got one for CloudTrail and one for flow logs sitting there. And if you go to the access policy for either of these, it doesn't matter, it's both the same. You can see that this allows that audit logs S3 bucket. So when a log file hits the S3 bucket, it's going to send a message into this queue saying new log file is ready. And there's the name of the bucket. And then if you go down a little further, you can see that that role that I just showed you is allowed to receive messages and delete messages from this queue. So as new log files come in, messages will hit this queue, and then the Sentinel role will drop in and process them. And if you're lucky, you can kind of refresh this screen a little bit as CloudTrail activity hits the bucket or as VPC flow logs pop up. Sometimes you'll see the messages go from 2 back to 0 or 5 back to 0. And you can kind of see Sentinel doing its thing in the background with these queues. So that's what you just set up in the last section, is all of those AWS resources. Now that those are there, you're finally ready to go back into the Sentinel service and set up the data connection. So you're going to go into Sentinel and go to the data connectors, and you're going to install the Amazon Web Services connector. And then you'll go back to Sentinel and you'll see here's an AWS one, which is a legacy one, and then an AWS S3 connector. That's the one you want to configure. Don't pick the old one. I did that on accident the other day. Pick the S3 connector, and in that S3 connector, it's going to give you a couple of different things to take a look at. So the first one is which role ARN do we want to authenticate as? And if you look at the Terraform outputs from your last deployment, I gave you those values in the output. So it says, here's your SQS URL for CloudTrail, the URL for flow logs, and the role ARN. And you'll do this twice. You're going to add the role ARN, the SQS URL for CloudTrail, and then pick the table as CloudTrail, hit save, and then go add another one where you're going to add the same role ARN and then the URL for flow logs, and pick the flow logs destination table and hit save. And at that point, you will eventually, it'll take a little bit to get set up. It can take up to 20 minutes, but I'm hoping you'll start seeing log data before that. So once you can just run some generic queries inside of Sentinel, you'll just see some data show up. And once you've got some data, at least in the flow logs, then you can jump off into the next section and repeat that attack from the previous workshop, which is from chapter 4. So I'll put 15 minutes on the timer here. We'll give you some time to let those logs start flowing in, and then I'll show you what that will look like when it's all set up and it's all running. So we'll talk to you here in 15 minutes. All right, folks, let's take a look at the Microsoft Sentinel AWS connector. I'll walk you through that real quick. It was pretty straightforward if you could find those Terraform output values. So let me switch over to my simulator. When you ran Terraform that second time, you should have seen the outputs, as you're seeing here on the screen, show up with some values in there. So these are unique SQS endpoints for your account, as well as your OIDC Sentinel role that's in your account. And all you really had to do, if you go into the Sentinel service, I'm going to open a new tab for this because I've got some queries pre-staged up here. So we'll go back into Sentinel. And if you go to the configuration and the data connectors is where you're going to see that AWS S3 connector after you install it. You can click on that, and you can open up the connector page here. So you can also get some info. Once things start flowing in, you'll kind of see the last time it received data. And, there is a little bit of a lag here as well. So just be aware, this isn't real-time data streaming. We've got a pull-based logging architecture method in play. And what all that really means is that Sentinel on its own interval basically is just looking in the queue for messages and then pulling that data over. So it's not going to be, real-time detection, but normally once things get going within 5 or 10 minutes, you've got data there. So you can see here, like here's my data received. I deployed this a couple of days ago. That's let's see, the green one is the flow logs. CloudTrail, I've got some information in there just because I haven't really used the account that this is sitting in since I did it. So I've got like 63 things that were captured or whatever. So if you open the connector page, this is where you come in here and configure these. So you should have been able to find the section where you added your role ARN, your queue URL, and then you pick that destination table. And it supports flow logs, guard duty, CloudTrail, and then there is a generic Cloud Watch option, which I was going to set up for this event. It's a little complicated, and that goes with almost every time I mention AWS in a sentence, to be honest. That you've got to set up basically from CloudWatch. You have to stream that into an S3 bucket and do some ETL data transformations on that. And if you go through the install docs, which are linked there, I do take you to the page where it says, if you want CloudWatch, this is what you would have to do. But it requires some extra configuration and data manipulation on the AWS side to get it to the point where you can pull in CloudWatch log data. So I'll give you that as an exploring further. Maybe we can do a follow-up session, down the road, perhaps, where we just focus on that CloudWatch integration. But Ben and I were kind of chatting about this over the last break, and it's interesting that, we have to deal with this when AWS should probably just have a native way to just stream CloudWatch data into S3 without doing the Lambda functions and all that streaming and manipulation. So that's kind of how that would work if you set it up. At the end of it, you should have 2 entries here. That's what creates that connection. So at this point, if you go into the logs section of Sentinel and you say, just give me the flow data, over the last 30 minutes, you can change this box to kind of change how big the window is. You should have some things showing up. We'll dig into these IPs here as we wrap the session up in the next 10 minutes or so. And then in CloudTrail, once that starts working, you can run this and you should have some data show up in there eventually. It'll take a while. I mentioned in Discord, the easiest way to get data, if you're not really using the account, is just to run Terraform plan and apply again. And that's going to create some activity, that's refreshing the resources and reapplying configurations. Notice the user agent is HashiCorp Terraform, and that just tells me that's from me running that Terraform and apply command. So that's the step for setting up the connector. The final piece is to repeat the reverse shell from the last chapter. And we gave you a command. It's in the chapter 5 instructions. Ben dropped that in there. So you don't have to go into chapter 4 and reread through all of that if you don't want to, although you're more than welcome to set the reverse shell up again and practice that a little bit. And what we're looking for here is not only will you have that data inside of CloudWatch, which is where it was in the last workshop, now you'll be able to detect that reverse shell activity from Sentinel. And you could use your detectors in Sentinel and your runbooks and your playbooks to actually respond to that action inside of the Sentinel ecosystem. So that's the big win here and the big takeaway. So run a couple commands to try to create that reverse shell again, and then query your AWS VPC flow log table. And this IP address will be your simulator, your EC2 instances IP. If you filter on that destination, you're going to see requests from some private resources in your cluster's VPC trying to head out to your simulator. And that's ultimately saying that that cluster is trying to talk to something that it shouldn't be talking to. So that's the last step that I want you to jump in there and take a look at. What I'll do is put 10 minutes on the timer here, and then we'll come back and take a look. That'll give us about 10 minutes to wrap up the session as we head towards the top of the hour. So jump in and do that, and we'll talk to you here in about 10 minutes. All right, welcome back from the cluster attack detection. Hopefully you had time to kind of see what that looks like. As we take a look at the attack flow, I'll kind of walk you through that here real quick. If I go back to the AWS side of things, let me clear my shell out a little bit, and we'll close down some of these Terraform files. In the ACE 135 directory, there's a docs directory, and some of the chapter 4 stuff is in here. There was a reverse shell template which had a placeholder for your public IP address. So ultimately what you did, and you can just curl kind of like check IP.amazon aws.com, and it's going to give you the public IP address that is attached to your simulator instance. And what you wanted to do is plug that IP address into the revshell.yaml file. And so when this pod mounts, it's going to try to create a netcat reverse shell to this IP address. And if you set up a netcat listener on port 9999, it would establish that command and control channel. So you're welcome to do that. Those instructions are in chapter 4. You don't necessarily need the connection to succeed to see the traffic. So even if the connection is not established, it'll still get tracked by the flow logs for you. So all you really need to do is do a K apply -F, and you can just target the code. And let's see, apply -F, and you can just basically put the path into that YAML file. So you do the code ACE 135/docs chapter 4, and then revshell.yaml, and you just run that. And when that runs, if you do a K get pods, what you'll see is that you'll have that pod sitting there. And if your netcat listener is not listening, it'll just continue to retry it. So mine is continuing to retry. You know, it's at 29 attempts to establish this reverse connection. And that'll get the traffic there that you want. So as you go over to the Sentinel side here and go back to your flow logs query, you can just add a quick filter to this thing. And we can say filter, and then we're going to say DST address. And what you want to put in here is double equals, and we can filter the traffic based off of where it was headed to. So you can see in the results here, 10.60 to 10.60, those are kind of inter-cluster communications. And what we want to look for is the traffic from inside heading out to our actual simulator. So we'll rerun this thing, and let's see how this query goes. I'm looking over the last 30 minutes. So I'm assuming that Kubernetes is attempting to do that at least at some point within this. If not, I'll expand the time frame out. So yeah, there we go. We've got some traffic destination heading to my simulator, and you've got two different sources, which I kind of thought was interesting when I looked at it. So 10.60, 158, 117. And what I had you do in that section is try to figure out where is that. And you can go into EC2, and if you go to the instances, now this one, we're not going to look at our simulator instance, but I want you to look at the actual EKS node. You can see that that is one of the private network interfaces attached to the Kubernetes clusters node. So that's traffic from that node heading out to that destination, which is the simulator instance right next to it. So that was one of the IPs. If you take a look at the other one, it's a 10.6274. And what that is that's an actual traffic leaving the cluster and the private VPC, and it's going out over the internet. And that IP address, if you go to the VPC service and you take a look at the NAT gateways that are here, you can see that that's the private IP address of the NAT gateway. So that's the traffic going from the Kubernetes cluster to the NAT gateway for NAT translation, and then back out to the public IP address that is your cloud security flight simulator. So those are the two different IPs that are captured in the traffic flow, trying to communicate with that, proving that, hey, Sentinel is now able to kind of watch your AWS resources for anomalies and help you build your detections out a little bit. So that's cross-cloud integration between AWS and with Sentinel. The Google Cloud Flow is a little bit different. It uses logs going into PubSub, which is their kind of like push-pull log mechanism. And you'd set up a PubSub topic, and then using OpenID Connect again, give the Sentinel instance permissions to go into your Google Cloud project and do the same thing. That's a workshop for a different day. At this point, make sure you run the end of that instruction set. There are steps in the environment teardown to run Terraform destroy inside of the cloud security flight simulator. That'll tear down all of the Kubernetes resources and things like that. And then go back into the Cloud Shell in US East 2, and you can tear down the cloud security flight simulator. Make sure you do it in that order. If you tear the simulator down, you're going to orphan a ton of resources out there that is going to be kind of annoying to have to clean up. So tear it down from inside the simulator first, and then run the destroy of the simulator itself, and then delete that Sentinel resource group from your Azure subscription, and you'll be good to go. Off to chapter 6 for you next. So in chapter 6, join Simon Vernon. That's going to be on Thursday, September 19th. And Simon's going to talk to you about making the switch over to the new Azure Monitor agent. So that'll be an Azure focused workshop, and will be very awesome. So that's another workshop you can jump into on the journey here and just kind of learn about Azure logging and the Azure Monitor agent. So we're looking forward to that one. If you liked this topic, as I mentioned earlier, this is all part of the topic set with Sec 549 cloud security architecture. If you're interested in checking that course out, obviously give me a shout out if you have questions. I can point you in the right direction there, but we've got some upcoming online and in-person events. So CloudSec Next is the 2-day SANS Cloud Security Conference. That's happening at the very beginning of October. I think it's like September 31st, October 1st. And we are going to be 2 days of sessions there, some workshops. You can do most of the things even online. That's completely free if you want to check that out. But after that 2-day event, Sec 549 is running there. And it'll also be in Amsterdam and London as we look at some of the events in October, November. So reach out if you have questions on any of those upcoming opportunities. Thank you for attending today. This is the cloud security curriculums. We call it the flight plan. But if some of this was new to you, we've got more introductory resources, and then we've also got some more advanced resources as you move through your cloud security journey on, as we would say, inside of the curriculum on your way to becoming the cloud security ace is what we want you all to be. So thank you for attending. Hayes has been posting the survey all over the place, kind of in Discord and in the Zoom chat. So if you can take a moment, let us know what you thought of the workshop. So you go to sec549.com/Aviata05-survey. That'll be the short link to get you there. My contact info is on the slide. If you want to reach out with questions on anything, or just reach out to Ben and myself in the Discord as well. We'll be happy to answer your questions there. With that, thank you so much for attending today. I hope you learned a few things. We will see you on the chapter 6 as we move off into the next chapter of the journey. So thanks again. Have a great Thursday, everyone. We'll talk to you later. Cheers.